So we've been looking at this chapter called Art, and this first section is called On Eye-Opening Art. And that phrase is something that will come back through this particular section as to what he is referring to in terms of eye-opening. Now, eye-opening, when we think about it as a statement, doesn't mean the literal. It is, of course, it's an analogy or the metaphoric, in that when our eyes are opened, we are truly seeing things. And so that idea is placed in this particular chapter. Now, de Botton starts this chapter talking about the time when he has to go to Provence. And it seems to be a reasonably standard travel story. He's asked to go to Provence, which is in the south of France, which is a traditional place for a tourist to go. So it starts, when we consider it in the ordinary, because then, as he suggests, Provence is a place which is rich in the idea of what beauty is. And he makes this lovely statement, was that Provence was generally held by sensible people to be very beautiful. And this word, sensible, is used in an almost oxymoronic sense, or at least it's almost aggressive. It's almost suggesting that if the sensible people think this way, I must not be sensible, because possibly I don't necessarily agree. Is it derogatory of these people? Maybe. What happens is we get a pretty standard travel story. This story about coming into Marseille and then trying to get to his destination, and of course getting delightfully and wonderfully lost. As I said, this is normally the beginning of a fantastical and wonderful travel story, but of course the getting lost is pretty easy. He gets himself back on track, and he stops in a place which says, okay, I'm going to wait for the aesthetic in this moment. And he gives us a classic, almost cliched image. I stopped on the edge of an olive grove. It was quiet, save for the sounds of cicadas hidden in the trees. Behind the grove were wheat fields, bordered by a row of cypresses, over whose tops rose the irregular ridge of the Appalaches. The sky was a cloudless blue. Everything in that is standard travel beauty. And so he scans looking for it. He's described it, but he's looking for it. And of course, it falls short. Not because it's a cliche, not because he's a negative thinker, but because he hasn't been told how to look for the true beauty. His eyes are still closed. The environment is not transforming him. He is not connecting with it. So at this point, we don't have an enriching connection. We have a difficult one, and that's another part of our rubric, if you recall. And so he says here, bored and uncomfortable in the Renault's increasingly hot plastic interior, I set off for my destination and greeted my host with the remark that this was simply paradise. He gives the appropriate conversation piece. He does not want to be, of course, difficult. So the story is summed up in a rather mundane, dull conclusion. But then he extends to us, because we find places beautiful as immediately and apparently and spontaneously as snow cold or sugar sweet. Here, of course, he's describing beauty as mundane, as descriptions of the obvious rather than descriptions of the aesthetic. It seems that matters have been decided for us, and so therefore he lacks the appetite. Yet aesthetic tastes should be, or at least he says may be, less rigid. We overlook certain places because nothing has ever prompted us to conceive of them as worthy. Our relationship, and there's one of our key words again, remember that, the word relationship, to olive trees can be improved by being directed toward the silver in their leaves or the structure of their branches. So when we get the word directed, it means we must be led. Throughout the art of travel, we've been told about the guides. There are a series of them, Baudelaire being one, Wordsworth being one, Van Gogh being one in this particular chapter. Hence, travel without a guide is not travel at all. It is simply looking at things. The guide must draw our attention to what matters and how we are able to build a conception of a relationship with our environment. So we are directed to the pathos of the fragility of wheat, and yet the essential crop as its stalks bend their grain-filled heads to the wind. We're given, therefore, some poetry in the language. It has moved away from the mundane that was here to the poetic, which is there. We had ordinary, now we have extraordinary. The essential crop, as its stalks bend their grain-filled heads to the wind, we have personification. We have nature and wind. We have the sense of order and chaos and all of those things that cause us to have our heart jump a beat, as opposed to being told something is merely or simply beautiful. We may find something to appreciate in the skies of Provence once we are told, even only in the crudest way, that it is the shade of blue that counts. This relates back to his awful experience in the Renault with the blue sky, but now he's been told that the blue is what he must look for. And so he turns to Van Gogh, very famous painter, very well known by all of us, who spent time in the same area and was after the same kind of thing. He wanted to know what it was like to see things. And so we get this particular part here because he wanted to paint the South was one reason, a utilitarian functional reason, but he also wanted to see it. He wanted his eyes opened. However unsure he was of his own powers to do this, he never wavered in his faith that the project was theoretically possible. That is, that artists could paint a portion of the world and in consequence open the eyes of others to it. He set himself a challenge, quite literally. So he sets himself something that other artists had done for him, as is pointed out in the following few paragraphs, paintings as well as literature. And so it goes. But as this continues, we get to a sense of the final sort of conclusion. In this sequence here, we get a situation about what colour can mean to the artist and to the individual, colour in nature, colour in art. So always arranging them in such a way that their contrast would be maximised, red with green, yellow with purple, blue with orange. Colour is exquisite here, he wrote to his sister. When the green leaves are fresh, it is a rich green, like that likes of which we seldom see in the north. Even when it gets scorched and dusty, the landscape does not lose its beauty, for then it gets tones of gold of various tints, green gold, yellow gold, and pink gold. So here we understand that colour is what we should be looking for in the landscape, transformation of colour, because the artist and the guide has led us to that conclusion. We get a photo here of the olive trees, and then we get a painting of Van Gogh's Olive Grove. My own eyes grew attuned to see around me the colours that had dominated the canvases. Everywhere I looked, I could see primary colours in contrast. Beside the house was a violet-coloured field. Suddenly, the landscape is opening up its secrets to Breton. The guide has said, here is the space, but here is the aesthetic, and here is the beauty. And now comes the transformation, the moment of enlightenment, the moment of becoming part of what the landscape is trying to teach me. So without the guide, there is a massive failure and a mundane response to landscape. With the guide, it changes everything, even though the landscape has not changed. And finally, we get this fantastic statement of Van Gogh, which says, "The night is even more richly coloured than the day. If only you could pay attention to it, you will see that certain stars are citron yellow, others have pink glow or green, blue and forget-me-not brilliance. Without expatiating on this theme, it should be clear that putting little white dots on a blue-black surface is not enough." And that's the whole purpose of the art of travel, is that certain types of travel and certain ways into a story may or may not be enough. He then goes on with the tourist trail, but we will continue with this in another lesson.